In a quiet Kentucky neighborhood, a routine traffic stop turns into a high-stakes confrontation. What starts as an officer pulling over a luxury car quickly escalates into a shocking revelation that no one saw coming. One officer's abuse of power is exposed, but will his partner have the courage to stop him? The sun hung low over Lexington, Kentucky, casting a golden glow over the streets. Officer Ethan Bennett adjusted his rear-view mirror as he sat in his patrol car, idly scanning the traffic ahead. His partner, Officer Ava Stone, was scribbling notes from their earlier call, the sound of her pen tapping against the notepad breaking the stillness between them. They had parked near Ashland Avenue, a neighborhood where the modest single-family homes began to give way to upscale condominiums. Then Ethan's eyes locked onto something in the distance. A sleek black car cruised past them, the kind that turned heads. The driver was a woman, African-American, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit. Her posture was poised, her hair styled neatly. There was something about the way she carried herself that irked Ethan, and he couldn't put his finger on why. "Look at that," he muttered under his breath, a hint of disdain in his voice. "Fancy car, bet she's up to something." Ava, still focused on her notes, glanced up. "She's not speeding or breaking any laws," she said cautiously, her tone hesitant but reasonable. "What's the problem?" Ethan ignored her, already reaching for the flashing lights, with a smirk spreading across his face. "Let's find out," he said, as he pulled onto the road behind the woman's car. The car signaled, slowing and pulling over to the side of the street in response. The driver's movements were deliberate, almost practiced, as if she had done this countless times before. As Ethan parked and stepped out of the patrol car, Ava hesitated, watching the situation unfold. Something felt off. "Ethan, this doesn't feel right," she whispered urgently as she hurried to catch up. "You don't even have probable cause," Ava continued, concern edging her voice. But Ethan, his hand resting on his holster, shot her a quick, dismissive glance. "Stay back, rookie. I've been doing this for 20 years. I know a suspect when I see one." As Ethan and Ava approached the vehicle, the woman's calm demeanor did nothing to ease the tension Ethan was already building. The window rolled down, revealing a composed face. The woman's dark eyes met theirs with quiet determination. She didn't flinch. In fact, there was a confidence in the way she sat that almost made Ethan's irritation grow. She had an air about her, as if the situation was nothing more than a minor inconvenience for her. "Good evening, officers," she said evenly, her voice steady despite the situation. "Is there a problem?" Ethan leaned in, casting a long shadow across the interior of her car. "License and registration," he barked, his tone as sharp as his posture. He didn't answer her question, not even bothering with pleasantries. His eyes scanned her face briefly before flicking to the documents she was retrieving. Grace Thompson, the woman behind the wheel, calmly reached over to the dashboard, pulling out the required paperwork. She slid them across the seat to Ethan, her hands steady, controlled. Ava couldn't help but notice the faintest tremor in Grace's fingers. But it wasn't out of fear, it was more of a reaction to Ethan's increasingly aggressive presence. It was a subtle detail, but Ava picked up on it immediately. Something about Ethan's demeanor was shifting, and it wasn't in the way that typically signaled a routine traffic stop. "What brings you to this part of town, Miss Thompson?" Ethan's voice dripped with condescension, his eyes still trained on the documents in front of him. Grace didn't hesitate before answering. "I'm on my way to a meeting." Her voice remained calm, measured, her posture still upright, but there was a quiet defiance in her words. Ava could see it, a calm strength that radiated from her. Ethan's lip curled into a sneer. "Must be some meeting," he muttered, eyeing the expensive vehicle she was driving. "Driving a car like this." The words hit Ava like a slap, but she stayed silent, watching carefully. Her heart started racing as she sensed the growing tension. Grace, though still composed, wasn't the type to let an insult slide. She kept her gaze fixed on Ethan, her lips pressed into a firm line, but her eyes spoke volumes. "Is there something wrong with my car?" Grace asked, her voice still steady, but the edge in her tone was now unmistakable. Ava's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a routine stop. There was something more to it, and she knew it wasn't coming from Grace. Something in Ethan's tone was off. He was no longer acting professionally. his behavior sliding into something far more personal and far more dangerous. Before Ava could voice her concern, Ethan was already yanking the door open, his hand gripping the handle so tight that his knuckles turned white. "Step out of the car," he barked. The command was jarring, and for a brief moment Ava froze. Grace, however, was already unbuckling her seatbelt with deliberate calm, her movements smooth as she stepped out onto the pavement. The air was thick, the crowd starting to gather. But Grace stood her ground. She wasn't intimidated. As Grace stepped out of the car, Ethan's grip on her arm tightened, a move that spoke volumes about his intentions. His hand wasn't gentle, it was an assertion of control. The crowd watching from the sidewalk seemed to breathe in unison, sensing the growing tension in the air. Grace's eyes locked onto his, unflinching, her jaw set with quiet determination. "Let go of me," she said, her voice calm but her eyes burning with a quiet fury. But Ethan didn't release his hold. Instead, he tugged at her arm, pulling her away from the car with unnecessary force. Grace stumbled slightly, catching herself against the doorframe, but she didn't falter. There was no panic in her demeanor, just a steady resolve. She wasn't going to allow herself to be intimidated. She had dealt with far worse than this, and it showed. "There's enough, Ethan," Ava finally spoke up, her voice trembling but firm. Her partner's behavior was crossing a line, and every instinct within her screamed that this was wrong. Her heart raced as she took a step forward, but she hesitated, unsure whether her voice alone would be enough to stop this escalating situation. Ethan shot her a sharp glare, his eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this, rookie." Ava's gut twisted as she watched Grace. There was no fear in her eyes, but she knew the situation was becoming more dangerous by the second. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It was about power, and Ethan was flexing it in all the wrong ways. Grace stood tall, her shoulders squared, and her voice rang out once more, unwavering. "You're harassing me, Officer Bennett. I haven't done anything wrong." But Ethan wasn't listening. His actions were calculated, designed to provoke, to assert dominance. As Grace's bag fell to the ground, spilling its contents, keys, a phone, a notepad, Ava felt her stomach churn. Ethan's movements were deliberate, rifling through Grace's belongings with no justification, no permission. He was searching for something, anything, to validate his increasingly aggressive stance. Ava clenched her fists, her mind racing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The rules were clear. There had to be probable cause for a search, but Ethan wasn't concerned with that. He was focused on maintaining control, and Grace's unwavering defiance only seemed to fuel his anger. "What's a woman like you doing driving a car like this?" Ethan muttered under his breath, the condescension dripping from his words. The question stung, not just because of its implication, but because of what it revealed. Ethan's prejudice was laying bare in front of them all. He wasn't just pulling her over for a traffic violation. He was targeting her for the wrong reasons, making assumptions based on the car she drove and the color of her skin. Ava had seen it before in small ways, but this was different. This was blatant, and it had gone far beyond what was acceptable. Grace's voice cut through the growing tension. "You're violating my rights," she said, her tone sharp but controlled. "You have no reason to search my car." Ethan scoffed, standing up and holding up one of Grace's credit cards, as if it were proof of something criminal. "You're in my town now," he muttered, taunting her. The crowd around them began to grow, their murmurs turning to whispers, their phones lifting to capture what was unfolding. Officer Ava Stone felt the weight of the situation growing heavier with each passing second. This wasn't just a disagreement between a police officer and a civilian. This was a direct assault on someone's dignity, their rights. And then, the moment that would change everything. Officer Ethan Bennett reached into Grace Thompson's car, slipping a small plastic bag, white powder inside, under the driver's seat. The movement was swift, calculated. Ava's eyes widened in disbelief as he pulled the bag from the car, holding it up for the crowd to see. Well, looks like we've got a little drug situation here," Ethan announced, his voice loud enough to echo across the street. The audience, already on edge, gasped. Grace's expression morphed from shock to anger in an instant. "That's not mine," she said firmly, her steps quickening as she moved closer to Ethan. You just planted that in my car." The words hit Ethan like a slap, but he only smirked in return. "Nice try, Miss Thompson," he taunted, "but it's not going to hold up." Ava's stomach turned. She had seen enough to know exactly what had happened. Ethan had planted the evidence, and in that moment, Ava knew she had to act. But fear gnawed at her insides, locking her in place. Would she stand up against her partner, or let it slide? Could she risk everything for what was right? But then Grace's eyes found hers, locking onto Ava's with a pleading intensity. She wasn't going to let this happen without a fight. For the first time, Ava opened her mouth, her voice shaking but resolute. "Ethan, this isn't right." The crowd held its breath. As Ava spoke, the words echoed in the tense air, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to slow. Ethan's eyes snapped to her, rage and disbelief mixing on his face. But there was no turning back now. The tension between them was palpable, and the crowd that had gathered seemed to hold its collective breath. Ava's heart thundered in her chest as she stepped forward, her feet moving as if on instinct. Ethan's face twisted in anger, his lips curling into a sneer. "You don't know what you're talking about, rookie," he spat, his voice low and threatening. He stepped closer to Ava, trying to intimidate her, but she didn't flinch. In that moment, all of her fears, the fear of retaliation, the fear of losing her badge, the fear of standing alone, faded into the background. All that mattered now was doing what was right. "I saw you," Ava continued, her voice steadier now, growing in strength. "You planted that evidence. You're crossing a line, Ethan, and you know it." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Ethan's eyes flickered with fury, and for a second Ava thought he might physically lash out. The crowd had already begun to murmur, their whispers growing louder as the truth began to settle in. Some of the onlookers raised their phones, documenting the scene. Ava knew that if she backed down now, nothing would change. Grace, still standing tall beside the car, watched the exchange carefully. There was no sign of panic in her, just a quiet confidence that made her presence all the more commanding. She knew this moment would come. She had been here before, in the face of prejudice, of injustice. But Ava was different. She was speaking up, and that made all the difference. Ethan took a step back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, but it wasn't enough to shake the truth that had been exposed. He looked at Ava, his expression hardening, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a crack in the veneer of his arrogance. Grace, sensing the shift in the air, turned her gaze to Ava and offered a small, grateful nod. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice a quiet strength in the storm of tension. Ava's breath caught in her chest as she felt the weight of Grace's gratitude. The hesitation in her gut began to ease, and for the first time, she realized that she wasn't alone. There was power in standing up for what was right, even when the consequences seemed daunting. But Ethan wasn't done. He had already begun to retreat inwardly, his pride shattered, but he wasn't going to go down quietly. "You think you're a hero?" he sneered. "You think this makes you better than me?" Grace stepped forward, cutting through the tension like a blade. "This isn't about being better, Ethan. It's about accountability, and you've lost sight of what it means to serve." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Ethan's face flushed red, his eyes narrowing with fury. The reality of his actions had finally set in, but there was no escape from the truth. Ava felt a surge of courage rise in her chest. This was more than just a single traffic stop. It was about a system, a broken system that needed to be fixed, and she was no longer willing to turn a blind eye. She had to speak out, not just for Grace, but for the countless others who had been hurt by officers like Ethan. Ethan's sneer deepened, but for the first time he lacked the certainty he once had. He was standing on shaky ground, and he knew it. "You think this is over?" he growled, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. But there was nothing he could say that would change the truth. The crowd around them grew bolder now, their voices rising in support of Grace and Ava. The small act of speaking up had sparked something within them, a collective realization that they could no longer stay silent in the face of injustice. Ava felt the weight of the moment, knowing that she had made the right choice, even if it meant risking everything. The realization that the power to challenge the system lay in their hands, in the hands of those who refused to be silenced, was now clear. The echo of Grace's words rang in Ava's mind. Accountability. The crowd's growing support filled the air, and the moment became more than just a confrontation between two officers. It became a symbol of what could happen when one person decided to stand up for what was right. Ethan's bravado had cracked, and as he stood there, cornered by the weight of his own actions, there was no denying the truth. Ethan's eyes burned with humiliation, but it was clear that his defiance was nothing more than a fragile mask. His posture faltered, his earlier arrogance now replaced by uncertainty. The crowd, once mere onlookers, had become a sea of silent witnesses. Their gaze, heavy with judgment, bore down on him. They weren't just watching, they were absorbing every moment, every word, every action. Grace's voice, calm and steady, cut through the tension that had grown thick in the air. "You've just revealed who you truly are, Ethan," she said, her eyes narrowing with quiet intensity. "But the truth will always come to light, no matter how hard you try to bury it." The words hung in the air, their weight settling like an anchor in the pit of Ethan's stomach. For the first time, Ethan's confidence wavered. His mind raced, searching for an escape, for a way to regain control, but there was none. This moment, this reckoning, was beyond him now. The voices around him grew louder, no longer a mere whisper, but a resounding chorus. The crowd was shifting, emboldened by the presence of someone who would not back down. Someone who would hold him accountable. Ava stood by, her heart still pounding in her chest, but now her fear had transformed into something else, something stronger. She had made the choice to speak out, to confront what was wrong, and in that moment she understood the weight of her decision. The path ahead would not be easy, but it was the right one. Ethan turned away briefly, his face contorted with anger and disbelief, but even his attempt to retreat couldn't erase the fact that he had been exposed. The badge he wore, the very symbol of authority, had been tarnished by his actions. The community that had once trusted him now stood in judgment, no longer blinded by the false image he had projected. Grace took a step forward, her gaze never leaving Ethan. She had seen this before, the way people like him hid behind their position, wielding power without thought, without accountability. But today things were different. Today the narrative had shifted, the power had shifted. "We are all accountable for our actions," Grace said, her voice low but resolute. "No one is above the law, not even those meant to uphold it." Her words were a declaration, a promise that this moment would not be swept under the rug. She would not let Ethan's actions go unnoticed. The crowd seemed to inhale in unison, the weight of those words settling on their shoulders, solidifying the shift that had begun. Ethan stood there, stunned, his mouth opening and closing, as though searching for the words to defend himself. But no words would suffice now. The damage was done, and the truth had taken root. Grace's eyes softened slightly as she turned to Ava. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice a quiet strength. Ava nodded, feeling a mix of relief and resolve flood through her. She had faced a moment of truth, and though the stakes were high, she had chosen integrity over fear. But as the sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of backup, Grace Thompson remained unwavering. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice rising slightly, filled with the quiet power of someone who knew what was at stake. "Today we stand for justice, we stand for accountability, and we will continue to fight until the system works for everyone." The sirens grew louder still, but the weight of Grace's words remained in the air, heavy with promise. And as the officers arrived to take Officer Ethan Bennett into custody, the crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't just for the actions of the day, but for the hope that had been reignited, the hope that things could change, that the truth would always rise to the surface, no matter how hard it was buried. Officer Ava Stone, still standing at Grace's side, took a deep breath. The weight of the moment was not lost on her. She had witnessed the unraveling of a system, but she had also witnessed the strength it took to rebuild it. The road ahead would be long, but as she glanced around at the faces of the crowd, some hopeful, some resolute, she knew that together they could change the course of what had been broken. This was only the beginning. As Ethan Bennett was escorted away, the tension that had filled the air seemed to dissipate, but the weight of what had just transpired lingered. Grace stood tall, her eyes scanning the crowd, watching as murmurs of disbelief and vindication rippled through the onlookers. This wasn't just about one man's disgrace. It was about the foundation of a system that had allowed such actions to continue unchecked for far too long. The applause that followed wasn't simply for Grace's intervention. It was for the community reclaiming its voice. It was a collective stand against the very corruption that had taken root in places where justice should have thrived. Ava, still reeling from the events, felt an overwhelming mixture of exhaustion and clarity. As the crowd began to disperse, her gaze shifted to Grace, who was speaking quietly with a few of the bystanders. There was no triumphant smile, no sense of victory, only the quiet, steady certainty of someone who had just begun a long journey toward systemic change. "Grace," Ava said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her newfound understanding. "What you did today, it was incredible, but I'm scared. I don't know how to keep doing this, how to keep fighting when it feels like everything is stacked against us." Grace's expression softened as she turned to face Ava. The fierce authority that had been so evident moments before, now replaced with a warmth that was as steady as her resolve. "It's not easy, Ava," she replied, her voice low but filled with an undeniable strength. "The hardest part is knowing that the fight never ends, but the change starts with people like you, people who are willing to stand up even when they're afraid. That's how we make sure what happened today isn't a one-time thing." Ava nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She had stood up today, but the weight of the choices she had made, the words she had spoken, hadn't fully hit her until now. The path forward was unclear, but she was beginning to understand. Something vital. Change didn't come from avoiding confrontation, it came from standing firm in the face of it. And standing firm meant knowing when to speak, when to fight, and when to let the truth do the work. "I don't want to lose my integrity," Ava said quietly, looking at Grace. "But I also don't want to lose myself." "You won't," Grace assured her, her hand resting briefly on Ava's shoulder. Integrity isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when it scares you. And today you did that. The rest will follow. As Grace and Ava watched the last of the onlookers leave, the streets of Lexington seemed to exhale. The moment had passed, but its implications would echo for much longer. The truth had been revealed, the foundation of power had been shaken, and for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of something new, a chance for real change. The community was watching, waiting for the next step, and this time, they weren't going to be silent. The crowd might have dispersed, but the message had taken root. Integrity, accountability, justice. These were no longer just words. They were the pillars upon which change would be built. Grace had set the tone, but it was now up to those who had witnessed the events to carry it forward. The fight for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun. And as Grace turned to walk alongside Ava, her eyes resolute, one thing was clear. The journey ahead would be challenging, but it was a journey they would face together, side by side. The story of Grace and Ava highlights the importance of standing up for what is right, even when faced with fear and uncertainty. In today's world, where systemic injustices and biases continue to affect many communities, the courage to speak out against corruption or prejudice is more crucial than ever. Much like Ava, we may sometimes feel intimidated by authority or hesitant to challenge the status quo. However, true integrity comes from understanding when to act, even in difficult situations. This story teaches us that personal integrity is not about being perfect, but about choosing to do the right thing, especially when it's uncomfortable. When we see something wrong, whether in our workplaces, communities, or even in our own lives, we have a responsibility to speak up and take action. Much like Ava, it is essential to trust in our ability to make a difference, even if it means risking something in the process. The most significant change begins with small acts of courage. Take this lesson into your life by recognizing moments when your voice can make a difference. Whether it's standing up against unfair treatment, calling out behavior that harms others, or simply supporting those who are voiceless, remember that your actions matter. Integrity, accountability, and courage are values that build stronger, more just communities, just like Grace and Ava showed us.